Welcome back. This is week 10 of inverse methods in heat transfer. We are in the second video. In the last video, I had talked briefly about why we try to use deep networks, giving you a simple example of the XOR gate. In this video, we basically aim to go through a forward pass. I had talked about the forward model of the neural network. We want to do that. I'll also give you a brief introduction. This is going to be very brief and possibly slightly inaccurate on what the idea is. I mean, why does the neural network have any relation whatsoever to biology or to our brain? I do want to point out that in my personal opinion, this analogy between a brain and a neural network is quite stretched. Nonetheless, this was the historical reason how neural networks came to be. And by now, I take a very, at least in this course, I'm going to take a view that neural network is simply a function approximation like Fourier series or something of that sort. But nonetheless, since there are biological reasons for this, let's take a look at that. Okay, so when you look at the biological picture, here it is on the left-hand side. So something like this basically exists within our brain. It's quite a complex picture. You have a whole bunch of cells, and there are electrical impulses. Whenever you have a thought, when you see something, there is an electric impulse that moves in a specific direction. So this thing, this line in the middle is somewhat of the concrete example of what we draw as weights. And the electrical impulse is basically our forward propagation on what we basically simulate as if it's a computation. Okay. And when you look at it, you have the cell body, and these dendrites are some kind of network connections. We will see them as network connections, which receive messages from other cells. Axons pass messages away from the cell. Now, within this, there is something called the action potential, which is the electric signal which travels down an axon. And when it comes to the next cell, it either activates it or it doesn't. Now, one thing which we do know is something called neurons that fire together, wire together, this kind of information you would have probably heard. These messages are mediated by these connections that go in the middle, and you have something called the myelin sheath, which you can see here. This myelin sheath basically tends to reinforce and make communication easy between two cells that fire together very frequently. So the idea is supposed to be similar to increasing the weight between one neuron and the other neuron in case it turns out that the connection is really strong. So these are some basic ideas that people took. The idea of weights in the middle of two neurons. The weights can actually grow stronger or weaker, just like myelin sheath enables, and maybe other biological mechanisms enable. And the fact that even if something hits, this need not fire fully, as I'll show you later, and as I have shown you earlier also, just because things sum up through all these connections. So you can see these as incoming weights to this neuron. And just because they sum up together to a certain value doesn't still mean that it has to fire. There might be a step function. After a certain amount of activation has taken place, then the neuron might fire. Otherwise, it might refuse to fire, just like a human being has to be shaken up a little bit before they wake up. Now, all this is just a brief and, like I said, a slightly inaccurate description of biology, because I am not a biologist, obviously. So here is looking at this kind of picture. Something similar to this is the first attempt that was made for neural networks. I have not covered the history of neural networks here. The course is not meant for that. But as you can see, it's at least an 80-year history. So the first mathematical model of a neuron was like this. You will see it looks remarkably similar to what we are doing, except all we do here is, this was called the McCulloch-Pits neuron. You will basically have summation of xi. Notice there will be no wi here. You simply sum up x1 plus x2 plus x3, etc., etc. And you just check whether it is greater than a specific threshold. So in our current notation, we will simply do a sigma. All these weights are 1. These are xi. You sum these up, and then you run through a step function. That is basically the McCulloch-Pits neuron. it was the first mathematical model. As you can see, the output is either 0 or 1. The idea was to simulate simple logic gates. And as I told you, put together an entire circuit based on these simple logic gates. Once again, you can simulate AND, or etc., but you can't simulate XOR with this kind of behavior. You really can't. But you can get AND, you can get OR and stuff like that with this kind of neuron. Now, after this, the next major breakthrough was the Rosenblatt perceptron, and what we are going to discuss later on today in this video is something called the multi-layer perceptron, based on this word perceptron which sits here, which is basically for perception. So now you notice you have W transpose X, very much like what we had before. Now you have these weights which are sitting here. So now you have sigma Wi Xi. So it took 14 years to go from sigma Xi to sigma Wi Xi, which is the usual thing which we use in linear regression. Now, apart from that, you can see in the symbol, this is basically a threshold. It's called a TLU, a threshold logical unit. All it does is, you check once again whether Z is greater than some value. Let's say Z is greater than 0.5 implies 1, Z less than 0.5 implies 0, something of that sort. Usually this limit will be actually 0. Okay. We are not going to do either the Rosenblatt perceptron or the McCulloch-Pits neuron. The reason I'm showing this is to show that these ideas have been around for a long time, and what we are doing is one very, very simple small change. So instead of just going from sigma to this, people added a differentiable unit. So this one obviously is not differentiable because it's a simple step function. So we basically put a sigmoid unit, which is an approximation of this step unit. So we use a sigmoid unit, which is an approximation of the step unit, and that makes a huge difference. So we take output from there and then give feedback, as I showed you in the last video. So this was the Rosenblatt perceptron. It is only putting together a series of Rosenblatt perceptrons that we get the multi-layer perceptron, which we will look at shortly. But before that, here are some notations that we will be using as we go forward. Some of the notation can be confusing based on what exists in the literature. I am going to use typically W for all the unknown parameters. Many people use theta in the literature. If we use theta, it gets easily confused with temperature. So we are not going to use theta. I'm going to use W. So typically, notice we have Z is W1 X1 plus W2 X2 plus W0 X0. Okay. Another way of writing it is W1 X1 plus W2 X2. Let's say there are only 2 units plus B. This whole thing is called B, where B is W0 and then we don't multiply by an X0, which was always 1. So this is called the weight. I will say this again in this video, and this is called a bias. Okay. So this notation I'm going to call the algebraic notation, as I said earlier. Some people might write W dot X, though this is almost never there, but you can use it that way because W is a vector, W0, W1 up till Wn. X is a vector where one of these is a constant and others are variables, 1 X1 through Xn. If you take a dot product, you again get this W1 X1 up till W0 X0. Also in the last video, couple of videos, I have used this W transpose X. W is a column matrix and X is also a column matrix. If you take W transpose multiplied by X, you will again get W dot X. This portion is called B, the bias, by several people, and W1 through Wn are called weights. So once again, I'll write this here. There's a company, in fact, called Weights and Biases, which deals with tracking various machine learning experiments that you have done. So this is W, this is B. So depending on how a code is written, some people write W transpose X plus B, and some people simply write W transpose X. In case they write plus B, then this W will consist of only W1 through Wn and will not have W0. So in packages such as TensorFlow, it is sometimes easier to consider the bias separately rather than in a unified fashion. I am primarily going to use the notation where W0 is already included and B is thrown out. It's easier for me to write it that way. So I'm going to use that notation at least for the rest of this course. The universal approximation theorem, as I showed you last time, simply says that if you have sufficient data, neurons, we can approximate any function to any desired accuracy. The point here is each one of these things is basically a perceptron, except you will usually not have the step function. You will usually have something smoother, but that's also not necessary. You can put a step function and this will still be called a MLP, a multi-layer perceptron. Instead of that, you can use a sigmoid, etc., etc. The key thing here, of course, is the universal approximation theorem. That's what lets us use neural networks easily. So neural networks were inspired, as I said here, by biology and the structure of this kind of connection. That is, each neuron is connected to many other neurons. But in the brain, it doesn't look like layer by layer. It's not as systematic as this. There might be some connections which are missing. Some might be connected, but etc., etc. This is simply a MLP is a nice abstract structure that we can use systematically in order to solve neural network problems. I had shown this a week or so ago, but this is just to, again, reinforce in your mind that every picture corresponds to some algebra and every algebra corresponds to some picture. If I want to represent W0 plus W1x, I can do so with a figure or with algebra. So the figure is here, W0 plus W1x, the algebra is here. Similarly, this figure corresponds to some algebra. So when you see this, you should not think picture, you should actually think that this is a mathematical function. So this entire picture represents a mathematical function. What function does it represent? Now, that is a little bit hard to write. You can think of this as a series or as a function of a function. So the way we do it is, if you take this neuron gets input from all these 5 neurons, then you do W1x1 plus W2x2 plus W3x3, W4x4, W5x5, sum those together, and then run it through some function G. What that function is depends on how the neural network is specified. I'll talk about, in the last video of this week, I'll talk about various functions you can use or have been used successfully with the neural networks. But the earliest one was the sigmoid. The sigmoid, as is written here, is the same thing that we used for logistic regression, 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus z or e to the power minus x. It goes to 0 to 1. This is basically a smoother version of our step function. So instead of using a step function which is not differentiable, you would like to use a sigmoid. So from here to here is a sigmoid. And that's it. So you calculate this neuron, it gives an output, we call it A1. This one gives an output, we call it A2, A3, just like we did with the XOR gate. And let's say this is 7 neurons, so A7. And when you look at this one gets an input from A1, from A2, from A3, from A4. So you can write an actual mathematical expression which will involve lots and lots of unknown parameters. When you look at this is finally still going to be a function of all these 5 input neurons, except the expression is going to look a little bit messy. Other than that, there is no big deal. Okay, so it is just a long expression. This one, let's call this B1, B2, B3, etc. up till B7. You can write this in terms of B1 through B7. You can write B1 through B7 in terms of A1 through A7. And A1 through A7 can be written in terms of X1 through X5. So in the end, this is always a function of X1 through X5. So this is some function of X1, X2, X3, X4, X5. Okay. The point, of course, is the entire thing is just a diagrammatic representation of a mathematical function. So one important thing in terms of pictorial notation. So this is basically a pictorial notation, weights and biases, as I talked about. Now, typically what is shown in a network is something of this sort. Okay, the biases are almost never explicitly shown. Something of this sort is what is shown. But what it really means is there is an extra unit here which feeds into all these. Okay, so this is basically the bias unit. So even though only this is what is shown, what it means is there was a 1 here, there is x1, there was also a W0 here and a W1, and the actual picture is what is shown here. Okay. So this unit is basically called a bias unit, sometimes denoted, as I said, by B, sometimes by W0. That's because why we do this is when you draw this, it means you might have to connect this unit and this unit, but that's not true. The bias unit has no inputs coming from anywhere else because it's always a constant. The bias unit is always a constant. So this one is always a constant. It's not as if something caused this one to be what it was. Whereas if you look at anything else in the middle, like this neuron got some input here. But if I draw a bias unit at the top, that bias unit at the top will not have this. Okay, so this will not be there. That's because it's 1. Why should it get an input from anywhere else? So this is just some pictorial notation. So let's take a simple example. We have a single neuron. Let's assume that all the weights are 1. Okay, so all these weights that are shown here, this one, every single weight here is 1. I want to know what's the output of this single neuron. So this is, like I said, from biology to computation. How would we actually compute the output of this neuron? The solution is simple. We want the output of this neuron A hat. All the weights are equal to 1. So the output has, always remember, 2 parts. The first part is the linear part, which we also call the linear activation. So the linear activation simply is W0 plus W1 x1 plus W2 x2 up till W5 x5. So we can write that down here. W0 plus W1 x1 plus up to W x5. W0 is 1. Okay, that's because all weights and biases are equal to 1. So let's assume W0 is 1. It multiplies 1, of course, so that's 1. Then it's 1 times 0.1 plus 1 times 0.2. So this whole thing sums to 2.5. The next part, always remember, is we have 2 parts. This A hat actually comes as 2 portions. There is one summation, which we did here, and there is a G, which is a nonlinear function. You can also think of it this way. You had multiple inputs coming, summed them, and what came out was Z. Now Z goes into this nonlinear part, G, and what comes out is A hat equal to G of Z. So this is what happens in a forward pass through a neuron. These 2 steps. So the reason I'm spending time here is this becomes really important once we do the back pass or when we do the back propagation. So linear, fairly simple. This portion Z was 2.5. The nonlinear activation is A hat is G of 2.5. G of Z was 1 by 1 plus e power minus Z. So 1 by 1 plus e power minus 2.5. And if you calculate it, this comes to 0.9241. So we can basically see that what comes out here is 0.9241. I request you to go through this example a couple of times just to understand what is happening. Remember that the input of a network is a vector, as in you have multiple x's coming in, but what comes out is one single number. Okay, so the input is a vector, but the output is a scalar to every neuron. Now, for this video alone, I'm going to use a weights notation. That's because the first time people see this kind of calculation, there is a natural way in which they think. If you write left to right, this is the way you will think. I'm going to show you that weight notation. But as it turns out, for writing code and for writing matrix expressions, it's actually useful to use something else. But let me just write for this video, or I'm going to use this notation. But in general, I will show you a notation which is slightly different. Okay. Okay. For this video, what I'm going to assume is this. So let's say I have this weight. I can't call them W1, W2, W3, W4 and keep on writing them. That becomes too long. Okay, you need some nice notation to denote which layer we are in and which neuron is connected to which neuron. So if I look at this, I am going to call the bias unit, which is never shown as I showed you, or as I told you, as W, as the 0th unit. This is X0. This will be A0. This will again be A0, and I'll mention what this A0 is shortly. But this will be X1 up until X5. Okay, X1, X2, X5. This one here, we are going to call A1 because it's the first neuron. This one I'm going to call A2, and this will go till A7. And typically there is a hat which is put. Even if it's not put, it's okay. So let's just call it A1. But I want to call this also A. If this is A1 and this is A2, we need something else. So we'll put a superscript. I'll call this A11. I'll call this A12. Okay. Or some people call this A12, A13, and this one as A11. You can choose whichever way you want. For now, let me call this A10. Okay. And this is A20. By that trick, this will be A00. All right. Now, what do I call this weight here? Okay, or this weight here. So this weight here is in the first layer. Okay, so it's the first layer. This is connecting the left neuron, which is 1, to the right neuron, which is 1. So we will call it W11, and it's in the first layer. So I'll call it 1. Similarly, this one is connecting the first neuron to the second neuron here. So this will be called W12, but I should not get it confused with this one, which is also a W12, but this is in the first layer. This one, on the other hand, will be in the second layer. So this is W111. This one is W122. So just as an experiment, if we have this, we simply count. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is W4. And this is the third neuron in the output layer, W43. And this is the first layer, second layer, third layer. So this is W433. So Wijl is the weight connecting the neuron I of layer L to neuron J of layer L+1. Okay, so this is bias units are the 0th neurons. However, in general, this Ij is unfortunately, or it's called Wjil. That is, the order is flipped. But for this video, we will stick with this. The I represents the from neuron and J represents the to neuron. Now, why we use this will become clearer as we go on to back propagation, because it makes matrix computations a little bit easy. So that's the reason it's used that way. But some books might flip the notation. I'm just telling you what we are doing in this video. So let's do a simple forward pass calculation here. Instead of doing just one single neuron, I'm going to do a network kind of situation. So the situation is like this. We have a simple network. Again, the bias units are not shown. And we are given that X equal to 0.5, and we want to find out the output of the given neuron network. We assume that all nonlinearities are sigmoids. So we assume that all nonlinearities are sigmoids. Usually, in many cases, in fact, in the final layer, people don't use sigmoids, people use linear activations. That is, there is nothing further that happens. But let us say we are using sigmoidal non-neurons. Now, of course, we need all these weights. We don't need these weights. We don't know these weights. We also need the bias. Okay. So let me first give you two of these. So it said W01, 1 is 1. So remember, goes from the 0th unit, which is the bias unit, to the first unit, and it's in the first layer. This is 1. And the second one, this one is given as W021 is 0.8. Okay, so we have these two pieces of information. Here is the full data which is given for this network. You're given W01, you're given W02, this is these two weights, W11, which is this weight, W12, which is this weight, and then in the final layer, you have 3 weights. Okay, because we need a bias unit here also. So 1, 2, 3 plus 4 weights here. So you have a total of 7 layers here. Let's assume that the activation function everywhere is the sigmoid. As I said, assume sigmoid nonlinearity. So here is the network drawn a little bit more clearly with all the information given here on the right hand side. I would recommend that those of you who are watching it, pause the video and try this out by yourself just to ensure that you understand the notation well. It will obviously be straightforward once I describe it. The calculation is not hard. You just have to make sure that you're connecting everything, like things to like things, etc., etc. You just make sure all the things are properly computed. So we do this systematically. We first calculate A1 hat. Okay. So A1 hat, remember, is made up of 2 portions. You first calculate the linear portion, which is the linear combination of these two, and then you calculate the nonlinear portion. So we do the same thing. We first calculate Z. Z1 is, so what is Z? Z11 is W011 multiplied by the bias plus this W111 multiplied by X, as I have written here. This is Z1. You calculate this. This comes to W011 is 1, written here, multiplied by 1 plus W11 is 0.7 into 0.5. So if you do this calculation, you can write down here. So we basically get Z11 is 1.35 from here. You then calculate the nonlinear portion. Okay, first the linear portion, then the nonlinear portion. So once you calculate this, you get A1 hat or A11 is basically 0.7941. It comes by doing 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus 1.35, because it's the sigmoid which we decided was the nonlinearity in this unit. Okay. Now, similarly, we now need to calculate A21, okay, which is this thing here. Sorry. A21, which I have written the final answer as 0.7773. We can see the calculation for this 0.7773. It's a straightforward calculation, just like before. No major mysteries here. This has a linear part, which is Z2. And it is G of Z2, which comes out as A2. And this is a simple calculation. It's fed by X and by 1. So W02 times X naught, which is simply 1, plus W12 times X1, which is this, is, now you can see the weights. W02 is 0.8 and W12 is 0.9. So you write 0.8 times 1 plus 0.9 times 0.5, which is 0.8 plus 0.45, 1.25. Z21 is 1.25. Calculate the sigmoid of that. It comes to 0.7773. So this is also a straightforward calculation. Now, our final job is to calculate this. This is what lets us calculate the y hat, which we are finally interested in. So we want y hat. We want y hat. And y hat is basically exactly the same as A12. That's what we throw out as y hat. So this one has input from 3 places: W012, W11, and W21. And it multiplies just like the normal perceptron by the respective weights. So that's what we have here. W01 times X0 plus W11 times A1 plus W21 times A2. Okay, so fairly simple. Do the calculation. You can see that I have written exactly the same thing as what existed in the weights here, 0.7 times. Now remember, this value was 0.7941, which we already computed, and this value was 0.7773. So you add all those, you get the linear activation as 2.255. Do a non-linearity on top of that, you get A12 is 0.9051. So as you can see, the network was fairly simple. The forward passes, once you are given this value, move here, calculate this value. Once you are given that, calculate the final layer. This is regardless of whether there is one layer, two layer, how many other layers, the computation takes place in exactly the same way. So what we saw in this simple example was that you can do a simple forward pass through the network. We will see later in this week that you could have done this via a matrix also, or matrix operations, rather than doing separate scalar operations here, and that makes things more effective. Overall, in this video, you simply saw why a neural network is defined the way it is and how to do a simple forward pass for a neural network. And we will now exploit this in the videos to come this week, where we will also do back propagation. Thank you.